like to just start by saying Kayla is very sad she can't be here today. So, as you can see, the topic of our discussion now is stellar changes and their impact on us. And I think I'd like to start by reading a poem by English poet John Milton. I think it's a beautiful little poem. A broad and ample road, whose dust is gold, and pavement stars as starts to thee appear, soon in the galaxy, that Milky Way, which nightly as a circling zone thou seest powdered with stars. I think that's just beautiful imagery for what we see when we look up at night. Well, since as far back as oral history and written history is recorded, mankind has been fascinated with the heavens. Establishing an understanding of the heavenly bodies and observing their processions has been an important pursuit for many ancient peoples all over the globe. However, without a strict scientific language to define what they saw, much of what they recorded and much of what they believed was written as metaphor and myth and legend. As mankind marched ahead with a scientific method, we began to develop a concise language to identify the heavens and explain what's happening up there. In contemporary astrophysics, the ancient wisdom is now completely considered useless. This has left us with two seemingly opposite understandings of our place in the cosmos. On the one hand, science seeks to divide each concept so that they may be understood and labelled independently of the other disciplines. The beliefs developed by the dogma of science are presented to us via documentary film without clarification as to which are facts and which are hypotheses quite often. On the other hand, our ancient understandings reach us via poorly translated snippets from languages we don't fully understand, and which are often anecdotal, metaphorical, and vague, with cited sources being deities and other prophets. So truly then, how can we know about our place in the cosmos? Can the ancient wisdom and the modern view be reconciled? Is there a point where they meet? Can they be matched up? You can see on this slide here, I've got sort of a basic representation on the left, how science views our solar system, heliocentric, with the sun in the centre, but the ancients were just looking up at the sky from where they were, and so they had a geocentric view on the solar system. So let us start with the ancient perspective, because it came first, right? Greek mythology used the stars to tell of great beasts and the heroes who had fought them. The characters were used to describe archetypes within the peoples, and the gods had domains, and the heroes had specific qualities. The men and women who made it to this land in canoes used the stars as navigation, and as we know, a lot of cultures use the stars as navigation. Songs, stories, and oral tradition were employed to pass on information about stars and what their locations mean, and like other cultures, a lot of archetypical information was also included in these traditions. According to certain anthropologists, the Dogon tribe, which are pictured here, of West Africa displayed advanced knowledge of a particular star in the Sirius constellation. Ancient traditions and complex ceremonies aligned with the movement of the star, and through oral tradition, its significance is explained to the tribe. What is fascinating, though, is that the star itself is completely invisible to the naked eye. We can't see it in the sky. It wasn't until the early 70s that astrophysicists discovered the star. It's quite interesting, isn't it? How did they know? I really like that chap up there in the middle with his flintlock. That was actually taken in 2011, and he's kept it in working order because that is very important to his livelihood. These are some images from their little dance that they do every year or whenever that star makes a movement that they find important. I think it's quite interesting how colourful and distinct the masks are.
What is the right, lower right one?
That's one of the places that they live, just crammed in there under that cliff face. So the information as presented by these ancient societies can be loosely grouped into 4 categories. Astrology, and many societies are strongly flavoured by the idea that the position of each celestial body has a direct and noticeable effect on everything here on Earth, including us. As we know today, astrology is often used for entertainment purposes, and you can find it in the back of cheap magazines and the newspaper. Navigation, as we talked about, many seafaring nations relied on the stars to navigate. Narration, often the stars are used as a backdrop to tell the story of creation or the birth of a particular society. Moral guidance is also dispensed within this category, and struggles between the forces of good and evil and the complex relationship between man and the gods. Prophecy, that's an area that we haven't touched on yet. The societies which displayed quite advanced knowledge of the stars also seem to have quite a definite idea of our future, which is quite an interesting point, I think. So the first 3 categories, they're quite interesting, but they sort of have historical meaning, whereas that last category may still be pertinent to us today. So I think that's the one we might investigate. So with that in mind, let's find out what they said about our modern era. I think a good place to start is in the Bible. Specifically, let's look at the recordings made by one of Jesus' first apostles, Peter. He says here in chapter 3, verse 6 and 7, "Long ago the earth was covered with water, and it was destroyed. But the heaven we see now, and the earth we live on now, have been kept by His word. They will be kept until they are to be destroyed by fire." I've gone through and I've highlighted fire there because you'll start to notice a pattern as we go along. "The day of the Lord will come as a robber comes." I think what he's talking about there is the robber never sends you a text first to let you know he's coming. "The heavens will pass away with a loud noise. The sun and moon and stars will burn up. The earth and all that is in it will be burned up." I won't read that last one there. I think we get the gist from Peter. The Native American Hopi tribe, they have prophets who disappear into very special caves and probably take some very interesting natural plants, and they have a very clear image on what they see as our future, and they also mimic or mirror what Peter was saying a little bit. So they say that the first world was destroyed by fire, and they're a little bit unclear. Was it a comet, an asteroid strike, or a number of volcanic eruptions? The second world was destroyed by ice, and this, of course, we see when we dig into the earth. And the third world, and this is where we start to line up with what Peter was saying, it was destroyed by a tremendous deluge. So now we're in the fourth world, according to the Hopi, and they forecast that fire, again, will be the purifying agent that ultimately brings us into the next world. It's starting to sound pretty familiar. Let's go on. The Mahabharata. And I love this first one because it's almost like just a casual, the energy of the Supreme Lord looked like the Samvartika fire, which destroys all creatures at the end of the Yuga. Like, you already know that, but I'm just trying to explain what the energy of the Supreme Lord looked like. And then they go on other sections. "The fire called Samvartika, impelled by the winds, appeareth on the earth, that hath already dried to cinders by the 7 suns." That's another little interesting piece. It goes on. I told you it'd get smaller. But it's the same idea over and over again. It really doesn't matter which culture or period of history it comes from. A cohesive narrative exists about the end of our age. It will almost certainly be said to end in fire. We have another Native American tribe up the top there. What do they say? "Now we think that when the end comes, the earth will be destroyed by fire, and not one upon it will escape, for all the earth will be enveloped in flames, and all those who refuse to believe in that word will be in it." I think that's quite interesting. They're talking about a complete fire, which sort of if you think about how that would logistically work, it's got to be some sort of solar event. You know, you can't have a fire start in a city and take over the world. It'd have to come from the sky. The Mayans talk about the gods created 3 failed worlds. We have that idea of the 4 worlds again, followed by a successful 4th world in which humanity was placed. And they mention that their deity, who is the deity of fire and of storms and of wind, was tasked with destroying humanity. Again, fire comes up. The Buddhists talk about the Monaka mountains flare and blaze and become one mass of flame. The Norse tradition talks about, I'm going to really destroy this, Surtur. He brandishes a flaming sword, and at the end of the world he will go forth and harry and overcome all the gods and burn all the world with fire. The Gnostics and the Islamic, we don't need to read it, we get the point now, right? Like they all say fire, a global fire. So before we go on that train of thought, I think it's important to investigate the limitations of language. And it's something I don't really hear discussed a lot when we look at the ancient texts, but as John mentioned the other day, he's read Eric von Daniken. You'll know what I'm going on about here. So why do we need to investigate the limitations of language? Well, because the language we use today has been evolving for thousands of years. According to some estimates, we are adding over 700 words a year to the English language. Now, some of these words are pretty useless inside the ancient context. For instance, the word selfie, you know. It was unfortunately added to the Oxford Dictionary in 2013. But they wouldn't have needed that to describe what they were seeing. There are some words that they might have needed to describe what they're seeing. Words like machine, propeller, or rocket engine. Yeah. Is there anywhere in the Bible that these words may have been more apt than what we find? Let's have a look at the testimony provided by Ezekiel. Yep, you're onto it. Right at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, he describes what happened to him one day when he was among a group of captives down by the river of Chebar. He writes, "The heavens were open, and I began to see visions of God." So good so far. Already sounds like it's going to be quite interesting, actually, if you're looking up and there's God. Ezekiel continues by painting a very descriptive picture of what and how these so-called visions of God appeared. The image on the left of the screen is created by taking what Ezekiel wrote in a very literal sense, taking the actual words that were translated into English and then applying those to imagery. Doesn't really make a lot of sense to me. So he says, "As I was looking, I saw a tempestuous wind coming from the north, and there was a huge cloud and flashing fire surrounded by a bright light." Well, already that image on the right starts to make a little bit of sense. "And from the midst of the fire was something that looked like electrum." If you're not familiar with electrum, those are a couple of electrum wedding bands down there. It's an alloy of gold and silver. Well, let's keep going. Within it were what looked like, very important piece of the sentence, 4 living creatures, and the appearance of each was like that of a human. And their feet were straight, and the sole of their feet was like the sole of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like the colour of burnished brass. I've got another metallic object there. Over the heads of the living creatures was the likeness, it's another simile, it's not very definitive, of an expanse that sparkled like awesome ice, stretched out above their heads. Under the expanse, their wings were straight, one to the other. Each one had 2 wings for covering one side of their bodies and 2 wings for covering the other side. When I heard the sound of their wings, it was like a sound of rushing waters, like the sound of the Almighty. When they moved, it was like the sound of an army. When they stood still, they would let their wings down. Clearly, Ezekiel's language was limited. living before the advent of aerodynamics, jet propulsion, the internal combustion engine, or advanced metallurgy meant that if Ezekiel had seen those things, he would not be able to describe them in terms that we would recognize. He would have to use terms ancient man would recognize. It would appear that Ezekiel was aware he couldn't accurately describe what he was seeing, and some of that simile even survived translation. What looked like four living creatures. Today, this testimony is clear for what it is. A metal craft utilizing a mixture of propellers and jet propulsion entered Earth's atmosphere so that someone who isn't God could meet Ezekiel. Well, still God in the sense that everything is God. I encourage you all to read this book in your own time, and bear in mind that Ezekiel's descriptive limitations might have been quite severe. The Spaceships of Ezekiel is a book written in the early 70s by Joseph Blumrich, who at the time was chief of NASA's Systems Layout Branch. Initially, Joseph set out to disprove the hypothesis that Ezekiel was describing a UFO. However, a thorough examination convinced him that Ezekiel was describing an aerial vehicle. He then made detailed drawings of what Ezekiel may have been trying to describe. He concluded the technological capacity of the vehicle builders must have been somewhat higher than mankind's is at present. Joseph added he had seldom felt as delighted, satisfied, and fascinated by being proven wrong. I don't want to get too hung up on the UFOs in the Bible. I'm just trying to make the point that the limitations that the ancients had were quite strong, quite evident. So let's move into the modern era. And that's a good place to go because we have the full descriptive might of the English language now. Our solar system is now, and has been since it began, moving through the galaxy. As it orbits the cluster of black holes, we think, at its center. As you can see in this infographic, it has passed through areas of different energies in the past, and we believe that moving through these areas may have changed our planet. So we can see here, the sun and planets may have originated closer to the galaxy's center and surfed outwards along its spiral arm. Just like to point out that's hypothesis, not fact. Passing through bright star-forming regions might have exposed Earth to hazardous radiation from supernovae, perhaps causing mass extinctions. Passing through dark interstellar dust clouds could have altered Earth's climate, perhaps leading to episodes of global glaciation. And what we have over here is quite interesting. As we're moving around the galactic plane, we're also wobbling up and down through it. 200 light years each side, that's quite a lot of wobble. And it's thought that as our galaxy is moving through the universe, we're creating a bow shock. The universe isn't empty space, it's full of highly charged particles. And as we're moving, we're creating this bow shock as the two energies collide. And they believe that when we're on the upside of our galactic plane, we're exposed to a lot more of that universal energy. Let's move inwards a little bit from the galaxy into our solar system. Here on this image, we can see the solar system there in the center, and these rings here are the outer planets, so it's quite small in the middle. It's just a representation though. And what our sun's doing, as Murray touched on, our sun's expelling massive amounts of gas and radiation, and these are called the solar winds. They're supersonic, they travel through our solar system very quickly, and they're highly charged, a lot of conductivity to them. And as that expansion of energy outwards from our sun reaches the pushing in energy from the interstellar medium, which is the gas and charged particles from the outside of our solar system, it creates this shape. There's a balance of those two forces, and at that balance we find the heliopause. Something interesting to be noted about that interstellar medium and the solar winds coming out of the sun is neither force is constant. It's not always the same. And so what you actually expect to see, it's very hard to observe because we've only got those two little probes out there, and they were sent out in the 70s. What we expect to see is that form over time should grow and shrink and deform and change shape. It's a very dynamic system because it's the balancing of two forces. And if we can think where we see that in our lives, maybe down at the beach, we've got the balancing of the force of the tidal forces and the winds, and we can see it's a very dynamic, it's in motion. There's a lot of change. You go to the beach and it seems to be different every day. The sun's properties, such as its luminosity, are related to its magnetic field, although the connections are not very well understood. And changes in the heliospheric magnetic field have been linked with changes in total cloud cover here on Earth, which may influence global climate. Like the heliosphere around our solar system, as we saw in the last slide, we have a magnetosphere around Earth. The powerful force of the solar wind is multifaceted. It has heat and kinetic energy, but it also has electromagnetic energy. And so it interacts with our planet in many different ways. This force electrically changes our atmosphere, or charges our atmosphere. The solar wind applies a great deal of pressure crashing into our magnetosphere. And as that pressure is applied, and as Murray was saying before, the solar wind moves around our magnetosphere, it gets caught. The highly charged plasma gets caught in our magnetotail here. It's kind of like this little pocket. As the speed and pressure of the solar wind is adjusted, the shape of the fields around our planet are deformed. When the magnetic field lines collapse, that pool of energetic particles at the tip of the magnetotail are propelled back towards Earth with a lot of energy. When this kind of event happens, we see obvious results here on Earth with a massive uptick of the aurora activity at the poles. And if you really squint at that animation, you can even see just a little, in the last few frames, you see a little sparkle up there around the poles. Little is understood about the Earth's magnetic field or how it's even produced. We theorize there's a lot of ferrous material in the core of the Earth, but nobody's been there, right? However, many scientists blatantly tell us that these effects have no effect on us whatsoever. I believe this to be an example of the limiting effects of the dogma within science. Those who have tried to submit their ideas with supporting evidence quite often are ostracized from the scientific community, and I feel really sorry for them. A lot of them find it hard to make a living after presenting some of their findings. I won't go into detail now, but some have found that with the magnetic line collapses like this, it correlates with the climate, correlates with earthquakes, and even geopolitical events such as war. It doesn't matter at which scale we observe something in our universe, we find that there is an electromagnetic connection. Above the scale of galaxies, we have superclusters, thousands of galaxies grouped together. And when we get a lot of these superclusters gathered together, they make filaments. And these are the filaments we're seeing on the left. Murray had a very similar slide, I think even the identical image in his little slideshow. It was great. And on the right, we have a diagram of our own atmosphere and how it too is really just an electromagnetic circuit. So we're starting to see another pattern emerge. We saw with the ancients there was quite a pattern, and now when we look at the stars and we look at space, we talked about the filaments, the plasmic filaments connecting the stars in the sky. Everything is connected in a very tangible, well, tangible is not the right word, but in a very evident way that we can see with our modern scientific equipment. So to summarize what we've been through so far, we touched on the differences, the different points of view that we have on the heavens. We have the ancient and the modern perspective. We investigated how some of the ancient peoples were fascinated with the stars and how they used them to tell stories. We also had a look at the fire, all that doom and gloom. Sorry to bring the room down like that. And we've also now had a look at some of the connectivity that we see in our solar system and beyond. So now I think it's time to start blending some of this information together. You may not have realized it just yet, but everything we've been discussing is pointing towards the exact mechanism of what some people call Armageddon. I found these books here, over here, quite helpful by giving new insight into many of the traditional understandings of gods, angels, and our place in the universe. Not because it holds any new information on these topics, but because it has been received and transcribed in recent history. And so the concepts contained are written using the full descriptive might of modern English. It's just wonderful. In these books, Ra, as you can see over there on the left, he identifies itself as an entire society united in service to the universe. An entire society which solely endeavours to promote love and harmony. And they're united because each member of that society understands that they are all part of the one thought. Ra believes that the one thought is all that there is. It is God, it is the universe, it is us. All matter is energy, and all energy is consciousness, and all consciousness is part of the one single thought. Ra explains that there is a hierarchy of that consciousness, of which we have our part to play. This is all going to sound very familiar to everybody, whichever books you've read, it's pretty much the same stuff. But the energy being emitted from the galactic centre affects what type of energy each star within the galaxy will emanate. And so the energy from each star will affect the planets orbiting that star, and the planets will affect the creatures living on that planet. And we too, our energy, our thoughts affect our cells. They affect those that live within us. We see that in medical science quite often with things like the placebo effect and whatnot. In these books, Ra talks about the transition our society will supposedly soon be going through as nothing more than a flow-on effect through this hierarchy. Our solar system is moving into a portion of our galaxy which has a different energetic vibration, and this will flow down that hierarchy to us. I believe it's the same event that was described in the Bible by the Mayans, by all those other cultures we analysed. Ra quantifies the single thought as operating at different densities. He talks about densities of consciousness. As an example, the root races, very similar concept there. So this is from the 13th session in Book 1, and it's sort of when the questioner finally sort of figured out maybe we should start asking some big questions. And he asked about, you know, all the different prophecies and all the different ideas that are talked about the ending of our age. And Ra answered that the fourth density is, as we have said, as regularized in its approach as the striking of a clock upon the hour. The space-time of your solar system has enabled this planetary sphere to spiral into space-time of a different vibrational configuration. This causes the planetary sphere to be able to be moulded by these new distortions. However, the thought forms of your people during this transition period are such that the mind-body complexes, mind-body-spirit complexes, which is us, he sees us as those three individual concepts working together, of both individual and societies are scattered throughout the spectrum, instead of becoming able to grasp the needle, shall we say, and point the compass in one direction. Thus, the entry into the vibration of love, sometimes called by your people the vibration of understanding, is not effective within the present societal complex. In this short passage, Ra offers an explanation for the mechanism of Armageddon and also gives us a glimpse into the truth. When he talks about grasping the needle, we are actually in control of how Armageddon will proceed. You see, the hierarchy of consciousness is not only affected in one direction, but it is us as a society who get to choose how we make this transition. We can affect up that hierarchy. As we talked about in the past convention, biofeedback draws on the idea that we can gain cognitive benefits and perceptual abilities from seeing ourselves work in real time. Many are beginning to consider that we may be part of a great mind, and that to understand our place in this great mind is to take our place. Whatever answers are in the heavens, or how we will ever find them, are some things I do not know. I've got to give this little caveat. Everything included in this talk is information ascertained by other people. I can't really trust any of them. I've never met any of them. However, I feel that with an understanding of the heavens, we may be better able to understand ourselves. My goal with this short talk is not to convince you of anything new or change your beliefs. All I hope is that we can all start to see ourselves as members of the universal consciousness and not as rate-paying citizens under the jurisdiction of whatever council. Now, I kind of ripped through a lot of that at breakneck speed, and I'm sure there are some questions.
I was fascinated by that fluctuation of radiation, or whatever you call it, to the earth and then collapse. And it reminds me, it's interesting to see correlations. It reminds me of the way air theory works. I never realized this, but like when you have a very hot parking lot and all of a sudden you feel a breeze coming in, it's because this bubble of heat has collapsed and it moves up, and then the cooler air moves in, which is the same aspect as that collapse and then refilling.
Yeah, that's some of my favorite moments when I'm doing this kind of research, is realizing that you're seeing an atomic pattern play on a planetary scale, or you're seeing these same things at various magnitudes. It's fascinating.
It's very interesting, the different civilizations talk about fire and the end of the earth. I heard in about 1976, the biggest solar flare ever detected headed towards this planet, and it was several times bigger than the planet. There is, what's happened is that normally all power stations around the world will shut down automatically. They're ready for this. Governments will go underground. And they were starting to do this. It's about, is it 3 days it takes for the solar flare to come from the sun to us? That there's a little warning time.
Yeah.
So the receivers picked up this information about this enormous solar flare, which no doubt was going to completely destroy the planet. So they made the preparations to shut down everything just before it came. And just before it hit the Earth, it completely disappeared. And I haven't found anywhere of any explanation of it disappearing, or it was deflected. And to me, there is something going on at a maybe higher level. There's somebody looking after us. And I have faith in that. So although there might be this fire, I think there's also other aspects to us as well.
Yeah, I've heard similar things to that. The Ra entity talks about various steps that they have taken to give us more time, because they notice, they go on in this book, it was written in the 80s, that at that period in time there wasn't many people who were going to be able to make it through. And so they've, according to what they say, they've made countermeasures to give us that time and to help us come together and figure out how we're going to deal with this. One of the measures that I've heard other humans talking about, and people, that they've seen these large blue spheres through various explorations of the solar system, and that these large blue spheres have been moving in certain configurations in our solar system to help buffer these cosmic energies as they come in. Because what I didn't mention is that we're already in that higher vibration. The solar system's already made that transition. It's us who isn't ready, and so, like I say, various steps have been made to make sure we can prepare ourselves.
Hi. Have you read the singularity effect?
The singularity effect?
Yeah, but
No, I haven't.
in the Bible, that we are in the Revelation period.
Yeah, I've seen. I didn't include it in the talk, but I've seen a lot of these prophecies include a short description about our time. I've mentioned to a few of you here. The Hopi prophecy talks about at the time of the end of this age, men will be riding around in horseless carriages on endlessly complex black ribbons, and I think that's pretty much exactly what we're doing.
I just thought of some ideas when you're presenting. I've heard of a comparison with the ancient Hindu story of the yugas.
Yes.
And these cycles that the Earth goes through. Mm-hmm. And there's supposed to be a comparison between the idea that we're orbiting around a central sun, and that's giving off streams of photons, and that is supposedly the origin of the story of the yugas, that the Earth goes through, or the whole solar system is orbiting around the central sun in the Pleiades, which is giving off a photon field that has an impact on human consciousness, and that every few thousand years it creates either an upswing in human consciousness because of this movement through the photon field, or going down into a degenerated state of consciousness because it's moving out of this photon field. And so there's that. That's just something I like to stimulate the idea about, because of the idea that these cycles of events on Earth are influenced by these regions of the galaxy that we're going through because of that, the energy field. So that photon field from that central sun could be part of that overall effect of increasing consciousness, because it's impacting on our DNA, upgrading. They say that we've got two strands of DNA, and then certain forces outside the Earth can actually unpack that DNA to create more superconductivity through the DNA to allow more consciousness to travel through it. So that's what we're seeing with all this, the movements all over the world with protests and anti-establishment and trying to find a better system, like the things like Yellow Jackets in France and all these protests, and is maybe a symptom of this moving into this photon field from the central sun that is upgrading knowledge of our sovereignty as cosmic beings, rather than just rate-paying sort of, council subservient beings.
Yeah.
Hi, talking about cycles again, more on the material plane. I've become aware recently of that the solar flares from the sun come out in cycles as well.
Of 11
and
years.
So that there are more flares at certain times than others, and we're now at a period where 3 of these cycles are coming together, and it's a major solar minimum period where there's very little activity, and they've shown in the last year the solar flare activity has stopped. And some people are talking about the fact that we're just on the precipice of an ice age. So maybe we're going to have an ice age before we're devoured by fire. But I also believe that
maybe they'll neutralise each other and we'll all be fine.
Yeah, exactly. The global warming may deflect some of the effects of the freeze. But I do believe that we can have, just as consciously, that we can have an effect on these influences by tapping into the unified field through meditation. And Dr. Joe Dispenza's done a lot of work on getting into so that we can access the unified field and using
consciousness consciously to influence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's fascinating research.
Yeah.
It's got a lot of good examples. Can we take
testing? I always wanted to do that. I just love this subject, quantum physics and science, and joining it in with all the spiritual side. But when you mentioned, Ben, the blue circle blob things at spheres, maybe the emphasis is a lot on the science side and what we do, but the more I learn about it, the more I think there really is not just a consciousness, but it's an intelligent one, and I like to call it God. And I think He really wants us to be connected. So it's not all about us having to always work so hard, putting all the work in. I mean, we need to, but He's out there batting for us. And I'm wondering if these blue things are maybe, excuse the pun, heavenly bodies, angels. You know, I definitely believe that they are out there helping us a lot, you know.
For sure. I think that a lot of the times when the term angel has been used, it's because they didn't have the descriptive language to describe what they were seeing in a scientific sense. And so that word is, synonymous with a lot of scientific ideas.
Follow on from the word angels and talk about the universal mind. Many years ago, I was told by Ra to invoke the law of one. And this, when I met Ben, we were talking about the law of one. But I'll go back to the law of one, because I looked up the law of one and read what it said on the internet, and I'd be interested to see whether it's any different to what's in the book, because I haven't read all the books, though I did buy them.
Good on you.
I haven't completed them.
It's a bit chewy.
What the law of one says is that the law of one is the original law of creation and is the supreme law over all laws in all dimensions. So what the law of one says, that if one is harmed, all are harmed. If one is helped, all are healed.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, in the name of who I am, and I am one with all, I ask that only that which is the highest good of all concerned happen here and now and through all time and space. I give thanks that this is done. So be it.
Lovely.
So we need to put into action the talk and the meditation.
Yeah, I think that that's a 100% accurate description. I think it can be sort of misconstrued that Ra is presenting that he has the law of one, but he's quite humble in the way that he describes, I call him he, because what else? He, she, it, them, they. Because that's what they're seeking. They still believe that they're a lot further along the path than I am, for sure, but they are still seeking that universal law. And I believe that they expect, once they truly find that law, we won't have a Ra to interact with anymore. They will just become one with the universal energy and dissolve into it.
When you shared that little bit where you said to understand our place is to take our place in the universe. So when you look at our responsibility, what we can do, and if there's this great fire that's going to happen eventually, I mean, who's to know it's not in a few months. The earth has heated up in an enormous way, that our responsibility would be to raise our vibration. You think of vibration when you think of electromagnetic field. So our full responsibility is to raise our vibration and to know who we are, and that's what we can do as individuals right now. To me, all roads lead to that one space. Yeah.
And as Anthea also mentioned, that helps fellow man. Yeah. Any more questions?
What we were saying before about Ra, one of the important things that I picked up from those books was the importance of free will.
Yeah, that's something that I found quite interesting. Growing up as a Christian, I was given a very long list of don'ts, and that was supposed to give me a moral code to live by. And it's quite a complex list, but I think Ra has, or not Ra, it comes out of a lot of different occult texts. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. And I think that has the whole concept of morality contained within it. And it's not so much, I'm going to do what I want, so leave me alone. It's about following your divine purpose, following your divine love. But it also has implied in there that to be immoral would be to affect somebody else's free will, to prevent them from having free will. And I think that in itself is a way of consolidating all of the different laws given in other texts into a very simple concept. They emphasize that a lot in here. This is something, that I was intending to put up first, because I find when I'm talking about solar systems and galaxies and things like that, quite often people have a text-based definition, but not an image in their mind. So this is our sun, right there in the centre of our solar system. Beautiful imagery. But that's zooming in. Let's zoom out. As we zoom out from our sun, we can start to see the orbit of the inner planets, and this is where we are. We're the third rock from the sun. That program won me a free whiskey and a quiz at a bar one night. I said, which planet, which number are we from the star? And I thought, how could I know? Oh, third rock from the sun. Perfect. But as we move out, we start to get to the outer planets, and that sort of gives a really good idea of why there's those two categories, because we just sort of fade away into nothing there. And then as we zoom out a little further, the heliopause probably take up most of the screen here, and that's the sun's electromagnetic influence. But as we zoom out further to the distance of about 1 light year, which is how long light would take to travel to there, we can see it's taking a while to zoom out. We can see the theorized Oort cloud, all the millions and billions of asteroids that we think are out there. But as we get out a little further, this is our little neighborhood. A few stars, yeah, hello. And it's all 3D, which I think is quite fascinating. But we'll zoom out a little further, and we start to see our area code, let's call it. And then maybe our city. And I'd just like to point out, most of what we know about the stars in our sky, those stars are here on the screen. It's not actually that far away that we see and are able to study stars. Murray was talking about we only see 5% of the universe. We only see 5% of the 5% of the 5%, really. But if we zoom out further, we can start to see how that massive cloud with us right there in the middle fits into our galaxy. Such a beautiful... We don't really know that this is what our galaxy looks like either. We haven't got outside of it to look back. But this is what most other galaxies look like, so we assume it's the same. Now I've got to be back again. Got another little piece here of bonus footage. This one I just love because it demonstrates how little we know about the universe. This is from NASA. The camera they were using to capture this footage contained the visible spectrum and the infrared and the ultraviolet. This is a 12-mile tether they let off the back of a spaceship, and they thought they'd see if they could test some experiments. But what the camera picked up, the astronauts can't see, is all of these little swimming things.
This view showing in that call reporting that the crew can see the tether and see the satellite. It's beautiful.
Orbs.
Some of them are moving quite quickly and some of them are quite slow. If you really pay attention, some of them change velocity and direction, which is something that debris in space shouldn't be able to do.
They also remind me of microscopic things, don't they?
Very similar looking. Now
just moving into sunrise.
That little stick in the middle is 12 miles long. So get an idea of the scale of what we're seeing.
From Columbia.
Now we can sort of see how they have a central area and an outer area. They're finding it hard to get it in focus because the sun was rising. And that's that big glare in the bottom right. So the experiment was they were trying to test whether or not they could generate electricity by letting off a very long tether which somehow used ultraviolet light to power. And so this tether, something interesting, when you take a string and you put it in microgravity, it straightens out. So this tether here, it shouldn't be, if it was on Earth it would be all loose and lumpy, but it actually broke off from the craft. There's a little satellite on the end, and they let it out and it snapped from the main ship. That one's huge.
There's a lot of things swimming in the foreground. Can you describe what you're seeing?
So as far as I know, there's no official explanation. They ask in the audio, in the audio you can hear them asking the men on the spaceship, what can you see? And they can't see any of this. I think it's only because the camera has the infrared and the ultraviolet that we're able to see it. Yep. And if you look closely, I mean, it's called the tether incident. If any of you want to look it on YouTube, it's sometimes some people have done tracing of the path, and some of these little things turn right around. It's quite fascinating.
The last screen.